Good morning. Welcome to Mortality with Meep. Today I'm going to be looking at the most recent total mortality by racial and ethnic groups in the United States. And we again have our line graphs where the gray lines are the individual years 2015 through 2019. Each point that's getting connected in this line are the weekly amount of deaths, broken out, as you can see here, in these 6 major groupings. The red line is 2020, and then of course that wraps around into 2021. And so I'm going to start out just looking across these groups. Unsurprisingly, the most number of deaths are from non-Hispanic whites. It's still the majority of the population, but more to the point, most old people are non-Hispanic white, and most of the people who are dying are old. We see that wave structure that we've seen time and again: spring 2020, summer 2020, then into winter 2020 into 2021. So ramping up and then coming down. And then now we've had a summer 2021, and that's in particular locations, not across the country. And I'm anticipating yet another ramp up. Now, because these are all being plotted on the same vertical scale, I'm going to remove that. We've seen that particular pattern time and again, and it's really not that different state to state. At least for the largest states, because I'm going to look at the entire United States, and then we're going to drill down into some of the most populous areas. Now, one of the things that we're going to note is, of course, these states don't all have the same racial ethnic mix, and that's hardly surprising. We don't have this broken out by race and age, but that is something that we can drill down into, not in this dashboard, but in the data. But there are some interesting patterns to note. I'm sorry, non-Hispanic American Indian or Alaska Native and other. You can see non-Hispanic Asian, Hispanic American Indian or Alaskan, non-Hispanic American Indian or Alaska Native and other are much, much lower than Black and Hispanic. I will look at those 3 in a moment, but let's just focus in on the Black and Hispanic for right now, just to make it easier to look at. Okay, so you may be wondering, even before COVID, we had a lower level of Hispanic deaths compared to non-Hispanic Black deaths, and you may think, well, that's kind of odd. Aren't there more Hispanics than non-Hispanic Blacks in the U.S.? And that is absolutely true. That said, what's the age distribution? That's number 1. And then number 2 are, what are the mortality rates? From all of the figuring that we've been able to figure out, again, pre-pandemic, mortality rates for Hispanics generally has been lower than mortality rates for non-Hispanic whites. There are a variety of problems with that data. That said, those problems will also occur in the 2020 and 2021 data. But what we see here in both non-Hispanic Black and Hispanic is we do have that wave structure, but it does seem that there are, just eyeballing it and remembering that the natural level of deaths is lower for Hispanic versus non-Hispanic Black. We notice that first spring 2020 wave seems to be a much faster, larger rise for non-Hispanic Blacks versus Hispanics, and we'll get to that in a moment. That summer wave, worse for Hispanics than non-Hispanic Blacks. Again, we'll get to that in a moment. Then that winter wave looks like, just from a percentage standpoint, and this is, again, just eyeballing it, I haven't calculated anything, that it's actually worse for Hispanics than non-Hispanic Blacks, that this is a much higher percentage climb here than non-Hispanic Blacks. And then for this summer, let's look at our little summer wave, I would say it's kind of incomplete data for something so small. And again, the summer 2021 wave did not occur in all states. The summer 2020 wave did not occur in all states. So what I'm going to do now is to add back in the smaller groups so we can actually take a look to see, do we notice any patterns? Now that we have a vertical scale that's appropriate for them, we see non-Hispanic Asian got caught up in that first spring 2020 wave. There's excess mortality in summer of 2020, but it doesn't seem like part of a wave. It's just elevated mortality in general. And then definitely part of that winter wave, still some excess mortality in here. And it's hard to tell what's going on summer 2021 for that group. Interestingly, non-Hispanic American Indian or Alaska Native, now again, the natural level is a few hundred per week, and we're seeing it elevated to like 500, so going from about 300 to 500. That's a large increase, but we're not really seeing a wave other than it's just generally excess mortality. And one wonders, is this extra non-COVID mortality? Because we saw a similar pattern with younger adults. There does seem to be part of that winter wave activity going on and continuing excess mortality. For other, we get a blip, and this is at, of course, pretty low levels, a blip in spring 2020, maybe minorly excess mortality in the middle here. There's a lot of noise. It's at a relatively low level. In general, we're not going to be looking at these three groups, though, for a couple of the states. I think I'm going to have to just break these out just because it's at such a lower level. So for each of the states, I will start out with the whole population. We'll focus in on non-Hispanic Black and Hispanic, and then some of the lower ethnic groups. But in general, you will not have enough people dying for it to make a meaningful pattern. So we're going to start with California, the most populous state. Just looking at this before we really focus in on anything, you'll notice, unlike the entire United States, okay, so like the entire United States, most people dying are white. Again, most of the people in California, or old people at least, are white. But take a look. Non-Hispanic Black is at the very low level in general. They don't have a very, the percentage of the California population that's Black is less than the national average. The highest percentages of Black population are actually, of course, in the Southeast United States. Elsewhere in the U.S., it tends to be concentrations, and we'll see this with New York City, but even there, it's not a high percentage compared to the entire United States. It is actually fairly high in places like, of course, Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, Georgia, that kind of thing. Hispanic, though, take a look at this pattern. We're going to really focus in on it in a moment, but holy crap, the winter wave was brutal. So 3,700 deaths the end of 2020 versus what's usually 1,000. That is a huge increase. We see something similar for non-Hispanic Asian, and we can't see what's going on with the two lowest groupings. So let's get rid of non-Hispanic white and some of these smaller ones. So we'll just do Black and Hispanic for right now, okay? And it is pretty flat for non-Hispanic Black, except for a minor bump up at the ends, okay? And Hispanic, on the other hand, they get caught up in the summer 2020. You can see that. There seems to be, it goes up, and there does seem to be a summer 2020 wave. As I said, the winter wave really hits hard for the Hispanic community in California, and maybe there's a little extra going on summer 2021, but it's not clear. And this is where you start having to think, okay, what's really going on here? And part of it is, where do different ethnic groups live in California? Okay. It's not an even distribution, and I'll show that with Asian in a moment. So, are they living in what are essentially COVID hotspots compared to other populations? Where's the black population in California? It's not evenly spread over the entire state. Think of Sacramento versus Oakland versus San Diego versus LA. The racial compositions, the ethnic compositions of the cities are different. And then, of course, there's much more than just the cities in California. Let us bring back these smaller groupings. Okay, so again, non-Hispanic American Indian, Alaska Native, and other. The numbers are so small you can't really see anything. But non-Hispanic Asian is showing a pattern similar to what we saw with Hispanics in terms of, now again, some of this is a little noisy, but about 500 per week versus 1,300 end of 2020, or let's see, 1,500. So this is like 3 times, and we had something similar for Hispanics. Might this have to do with, well, I don't know, was San Francisco and that area hard hit? Where are the Asians in California versus elsewhere in the state? So that's the kind of thing I'm having to think about, especially with a state so geographically large and ethnically diverse in terms of, you get clumpings at different things. Now, Texas is not going to be quite the same. And I'll just start, since I already have these selected. The Asian, these other populations are so small, even in normal years, they really don't have very many deaths, and this is very noisy. I would actually have to aggregate this on units much larger. So I am seeing, at least for non-Hispanic Asian, that winter wave was pretty bad. And obviously, in the aggregate, that's really going to show up. But let's look at Black and Hispanic in the state. Now, not surprisingly, the Hispanic population in Texas is larger than that of the Black population in Texas. And let's take a look. Ooh, that is definitely the summer 2020 wave, and we have a little bit of a blip of a summer 2021 wave. And there was extra mortality in the Hispanic population, and it didn't come down as fast, notice, as in California, just kind of slowly decreasing at the beginning of 2021. Interestingly, with the Black population in Texas, kind of had some elevated mortality in summer of 2020 and a little bit of a blip in 2021, and a little bit of extra mortality in the winter wave. Again, I need to aggregate these, and I will do this separate. I'm just using the CDC dashboard, link in video description, that you can try this out yourself to see these patterns. And it does differ state by state, but while you're thinking about that, look at those gray lines. What's your baseline that you're starting out with? What does the population look like in terms of age distribution, and then specifically for these very large states, geographic distribution? If we go into Texas, not Texas, that's where we are now, Florida. Okay, so Florida has both a substantial Black and Hispanic population, in addition to non-Hispanic whites. And, a very similar pattern with both groups, though it does seem for the Hispanics the winter wave was worse, but for Blacks and Hispanics, we've got that summer both 2020 and 2021 wave. Ta-da! Also a winter wave coming in here, end of 2020, beginning of 2021, coming down. Let us look at these smaller groups, but I think we're going to find that they're not appreciably large enough. It's mainly noise. You can see, this is just like a handful of people every so often. They just don't have enough of a population to even have something to compare against. But you can kind of see, even with the small Asian population they have, that there was a spike in the summer of 2020 and summer of 2021. Okay, our next location is New York. So we need to remember, we have New York and New York City split from each other. So New York is the state minus New York City. So we can see, boom, non-Hispanic Asian got caught up in that spring 2020, and then we see something of a winter wave here. The other two groups are just too small to tell. Let's try Black and Hispanic. Again, remember, this is the state outside of the city. And so places like Long Island and Westchester County are included in this. And we've got those spring 2020 spikes, but in a little bit of elevated mortality in the winter 2020 into 2021 wave. Okay, and a little bit, I can't really tell there's much going on in the summer. So let's switch to New York City. And of course, New York City is pretty stark. You've got that huge spike, and just in case you were wondering, I'll just add non-Hispanic white back into the mix. And pretty much the spike looks the same whether you're white, Black, or Hispanic. Those are three very large groups in the city. They have a base death count that's pretty stable over the prior 5 years. Let's look at the smaller groups. Oops. Come on, get in there. Okay. So here we go. We basically have zero data because there's just not enough for non-Hispanic American Indian or Alaska Native. But non-Hispanic Asian and other both also have that spring spike. We will see with the non-Hispanic Asian a little bit of the winter wave in there. You didn't see that so much with the other groups, but you know, it's kind of interesting to look at that and to think we have an appreciable Asian, Hispanic, Black, and white, non-Hispanic white population in New York City, and so it's kind of easy to see how much of the distinction just has to do with the geographic, like where people live, essentially. It seems to me that most of these groups were equivalently hit in the spring 2020 wave in New York City. Not much difference. If we break it out by age, maybe we will see differences there. Our next place is Pennsylvania. Okay, that's unsurprisingly kind of noisy. It's just not really a large enough population to see anything. And I'll throw in white again so you can kind of see what this looks like. Okay, yeah, so Pennsylvania is fairly white. Where you get the non-white population is going to be concentrated in places like Philadelphia or near Philadelphia. Can get rid of the white so that we can see the other two better. So not really an appreciable Hispanic population. You can see there is some excess mortality in that spring wave, but a lot of it's noisy to have to aggregate it. Non-Hispanic Black, you get that spring 2020 and then the winter 2020 into 2021. There seems to be some noise, some more spring excess mortality. And again, some of these we do have to question whether it is actually COVID or other causes of excess mortality, such as car crashes, drug overdoses, and homicides. And that's true for any of the populations that we need to think about. And then finally, Illinois. I'm going to throw the white population back in. Because remember, this is at the state level. And this is similar, this is a Midwestern state, but it's similar to Pennsylvania in that, yes, you have non-white population, but it tends to be, in Illinois, clustered around Chicago, unsurprisingly. So, yeah, this dashboard doesn't show this. This just comes from my own knowledge of having looked at a lot of population density and ethnic diversity mappings. So here we go, non-Hispanic Black. We've got that spring in both Hispanic and non-Hispanic. The velocity for non-Hispanic Black deaths, I mean, that is rapid compared to Hispanic, kind of slowly climbs and then comes down. And then both have that winter wave going again. And let's get the smaller groups, but at this point, we're barely getting anything. Yeah, okay, here we go. We've got the spring 2020, but a lot of it's noise, and then we've got a winter wave again. And as I said, I think a lot of this is just going to be concentrated in Cook County, in Chicago, Illinois. We're just looking at this whole thing at the state level, and when you do that, I mean, you're including a whole bunch of areas, and this is true when we look at the entire United States. If I did a map at the county level, if I mapped out, you know, percent non-Hispanic white population, percent Black, percent Hispanic, percent Asian, etc., you would see that it's definitely not an even distribution, and that has effects on what we see. I'm going to pick Georgia. It's not in my top locations, but just to show you what some places that really don't have very large Hispanic, etc., but mainly white and Black, what that looks like. So that's Georgia. South Carolina should be similar, but it's smaller than Georgia. Yeah, so similar patterns showing up. Whether or not you get that spring wave, Georgia has Atlanta. South Carolina, really, it has proximity to Savannah and Atlanta and Charlotte, North Carolina. It does not really have any kind of major city of itself. And no, Columbia and Charleston are not major cities. Savannah isn't even really a major city in Georgia. It's Atlanta and Charlotte, North Carolina. Those are the large cities that bracket South Carolina. So you can see there's kind of a spring 2020 wave, and you can see this with non-Hispanic Black in Georgia. That's coming around Atlanta. But we don't have anything like that in South Carolina. I mean, a little excess mortality in the spring, but nothing like the summer of 2020, and then, of course, 2021. You see that right here. So, things to think about. Play with the dashboard yourself. The patterns, you kind of have to keep an open mind of whether you're really seeing real patterns when you have levels like this, and it's not so noisy. You can kind of see these waves so much, but then of course when you get to smaller graphs, there you go. Anyway, talk to y'all another time.